It's my pleasure now to introduce our next panel. Dr. Allegra Mayer is the moderator. She is from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Steve Wirtel is the Executive Vice President for Business Development, Core Infrastructure. Mike Keller, Irrigation Support for Central Valley Orchard Management. Randy Holmes from San Joaquin Renewables, and Nora Cohen Brown, who's Head of Market Development and Policy, Charm Industrial. And the topic of the panel is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and biomass carbon removal and storage.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'm Allegra. I'm with Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And one of the things we haven't yet addressed today in this symposium is how are we going to take this CO2 out of the atmosphere, concentrate it so that we can store it in geologic storage or in other long-term storage. So that's what we're going to address today on this panel. One of the more promising ways to inexpensively capture CO2 out of the atmosphere is through a natural process called photosynthesis, right? Plants do this naturally. Using sunlight, they take CO2 out of the atmosphere and build their own biomass, which is rich in carbon. We can use that plant biomass to then convert it either to biofuels, bioenergy in some cases, and also to combust that to a form of CO2 that we can then store underground in geologic storage or in other long-term products, carbon-rich products. So part of the promise is also that we can repurpose waste biomass that's already produced, especially here in Kern County, through agricultural wastes or even through municipal wastes like garbage. There are many potential combinations for both feedstock, waste biomasses, the conversion process technologies, which we'll hear about today, and then also the biofuels that might be produced from the process. So today we're lucky, we're very, very fortunate to have three experts in the industry, in a flourishing and new industry of bikers, which we call biomass with carbon removal and storage. We're going to hear from, let's see, first is Steve from Core Infrastructure, Steve Wirtel. Second, we'll hear from Nora Cohen Brown from Charm Industrial. And then finally, Randy Holmes from San Joaquin Renewables. And so to start us off, we can just go down the panel. Could you please introduce your technologies? Tell us what are the feedstocks, where are you sourcing that biomass from, and what are the end products of your technology?
Thank you. Well, Core Infrastructure is a company focused on producing carbon-negative renewable energy from waste biomass feedstocks. And fortunately in California, those waste feedstocks are in relative abundance. We tend to focus on four feedstocks, one being urban demolition wood waste, low moisture agricultural residuals, nutshells, tree removals, etc., green waste that typically comes from urban areas, and forest debris, so dead trees in forests. And what we do with that is we put it through our process. It's an enhanced pyrolysis process to make renewable energy, carbon-negative renewable energy. But since the focus of this is carbon sequestration, we also make a solid elemental carbon char that, because of the way the process is operated, is entirely recalcitrant, which means that it will not revert to carbon dioxide or methane in the natural environment. So when it's placed in the soil, it will remain there indefinitely, in perpetuity. It also then provides natural benefits to the soil, including retaining moisture, retaining nutrients, and overall increasing plant growth and yield. So we're leveraging those ecosystem services of plants that you described to take that feedstock, convert it into sequestered carbon that can then be used in the soil.
Thanks.
Hi, so I'm Nora Cohen Brown from Charm, and thank you so much for having us here today. Excited to talk more about biomass removal. So Charm is a leader in the emerging carbon removal field and sort of the engineered permanent carbon removals, as we were talking about earlier. What we do is that we also use waste biomass feedstocks, so primarily either forestry feedstocks, so wildfire fuel reduction, waste products, or also corn stover or walnut shells or other agricultural wastes. We also use a pyrolysis process, but we do fast pyrolysis, so slightly different. And we basically heat that biomass without oxygen very quickly. It converts it primarily into a very carbon-rich bio-oil. And then with that bio-oil, we either take it to an injection site to either like a class 1 or class 5 well or end-of-life injection site and put that underground where it hardens within about 48 hours and stores carbon permanently. Or we are also in the process of converting that oil into a syngas that can be used for iron making to eventually create carbon negative iron. We also have a mobile process, so that means that we can process biomass on site. We have units that are about 10 tons per day, and so that enables us to be extremely flexible in our operations. And we also, to date, have, as far as we know, sequestered the most tons permanently of any engineered carbon removal solution at about 6,000 tons, which is obviously really a drop in the bucket, but we think hopefully someone will surpass us soon, but we are already in process both converting biomass to oil and also injecting that oil underground.
Thanks.
Thank you.
My name is Randy Holmes. I'm the CEO of San Joaquin Renewables. We are building a biomass to RNG conversion process in McFarland. We're well down the road in terms of design, permitting, et cetera. And the process involves using ag waste, which in many cases is just viewed in many cases as a waste, and processing that in a thermal conversion process so that we can capture and use all of the carbon embedded in the feedstock into usable products, namely about 25% of it goes into the RNG, about 45% goes into carbon dioxide, and the other round numbers 30% goes into the biochar, which is similar to the same stable carbon compound that is produced by some of these other processes. At the end of the day, we think this project will employ approximately 125 new jobs in the area. It's a very large plant, and we will be building out our own feedstock supply and trucking operations that will run on RNG, which will be produced by our own plant. The design of the plant has been from the beginning to minimize emissions of any sort. We've done extraordinary things to make sure it's water neutral and that we essentially have very, very limited other emissions of any kind. So we're well down the road. Thank you all for being here, and happy to answer any questions about our project.
Randy, that's a perfect segue. Thanks for beating me to this next question. I'd like to ask the other panelists as well to answer, how much we have that carbon that's stored in the biomass that you source for the feedstock, whether it's forest waste or agricultural waste. How much of that carbon, Randy's also already answered this, how much of that carbon do you capture and use for biofuel, use for CO2 injection, or that goes into the char product?
For our process, which is an enhanced pyrolysis process, it's about a 50-50 split. So about half the carbon winds up in the energy products that we produce, and about half winds up in that elemental carbon char that we then are able to sequester and permanently remove.
For CHARM's process, there's about 1.5 tons of carbon equivalent in every ton of biomass. Once you account for all of the life cycle analysis emissions related to the process, we sequester, it's about a 1-to-1 ratio, so we sequester 1 ton of carbon per every ton of biomass that we process. In addition, on the steel side, once we get to that, to actually producing carbon negative iron, we actually avoid 1.5 tons of carbon emissions for every ton that we produce, and then we also have a 1.2 ton removal of carbon, which is how it ends up being negative.
So good to hear. So Randy, I want to get back to you again, and we'll also go through everybody else. I understand, so a high proportion of your technologies can actually be converted to CO2 where it could be stored, potentially, in geologic storage. What's the permitting like? I know you've been through this, and all three of you are involved in figuring out where can we store this. What is the process like of getting a permit? Where are you currently permitted, and where do you hope to be?
Okay. Well, obviously one of the big issues of any developmental process is assessing the permitting risk going forward, because all the design in the world doesn't do you any good if you can't get a permit. So we're quite far down the road. We've gotten our CEQA process underway. Our air quality permits have been filed. We've been making some adjustments to the design of the project as we go, so some of those need to be tweaked, but the process is very well along. We've also filed a Class 6 permit application with the EPA for our carbon sequestration well. That seems to be going as well as could be expected in the federal system, which is, there's not very many of these wells around yet, so it's a slow process. The other constraint we're dealing with is that the regime for dealing with carbon sequestration in California in particular, and obviously Kern County specifically, is, from our point of view, as yet uncertain, and the ability of any of the policymakers to accelerate our ability to find not only what the rules are going to be, but what the timing is going to be a huge benefit to all of these sequestration projects, because until you get the sequestration methodology sorted out, I think it's going to be difficult to develop large-scale projects that are going to be relying on sequestration for the ultimate result of the disposition of the CO2.
Thanks.
Well, permitting is never an easy process, but fortunately for our technology, we have only one emission source, and that's the combustion gas that's used to indirectly heat the feedstock in the process. And so we were able to have this technology permitted in downtown Los Angeles at a site that's owned by Southern California Gas at their Olympic site. They were our partner on that project, where we operated at commercial scale for over 1 year, processing 1 ton per hour, about 24 tons a day of biomass feedstock. And a follow-on from that is we were recently selected by the California Department of Conservation to develop a project to remove dead trees from the Sierra Nevada forests and convert those into a carbon negative biofuel that had to be either hydrogen or liquid biofuels. So our focus has been on hydrogen, so we fit within the constraints of their grant, and we're currently developing that project just to the east of Porterville in association with the Tule River Tribe of California.
For us, we are sequestering in Class 1 and Class 5 injection wells. So for instance, right now in Kansas, we have a salt cavern where the state was concerned about a risk of subsidence, and we are putting bio oil in that salt cavern to help stabilize the structure. So it's one of the advantages of the fact that our bio oil hardens so quickly. It means that it is well below the water table, and it is, there's no buoyancy to it at all. So it's a much different type of sequestration than some of the other methods. What I'll say is that doesn't mean that permitting is not challenging. We're very interested in doing injection in California, but we know that it'll be a long time frame. We're looking forward to working locally on that. What I'd say too is that we do have some minor emissions that, for the most part, we expect as we get farther along in our process to omit completely through the process. We, in fact, already have one pyrolyzer that is running on the syngas that's produced by the process. However, that's something that we are obviously paying attention to when it comes to our pilot projects. This year, we plan to do probably maybe 3 different pilots in California to work on both reducing forestry, fuel reduction, working with fuel reduction programs where they don't have a use for biomass that isn't salable, that would otherwise just be burn piles. We will process through the pyrolyzer. And we're also looking at doing something similar nearby, with agricultural waste in the Central Valley to, help with air quality and biomass waste and prove out our process in the field.
Great, and it's glad to hear that you're thinking about the whole life cycle of emissions there. Is it mostly carbon dioxide that you're thinking about, or are you also looking at methane and nitrous oxide?
We're measuring everything that comes out just to be aware of, but for the most part, it's it's carbon dioxide.
And
And it's pretty minor.
so Steve, you touched on some of that you're working with tribes as well and sourcing biomass from forests. I'm curious for all three of you too, if you could expand a little bit more about all the stakeholders that are involved at each step of the production process, and who's the market audience for the end products, and who are you working with for sourcing, and what is that kind of relationship like?
Well, so for us, the stakeholders start with the feedstock suppliers, whether that would be forest residuals, urban demolition, wood waste, agricultural residuals. So we work with a number of aggregators of those feedstocks, environmental services companies, and others that are already managing that material, which typically is either going to a biomass power plant historically, which are rapidly in decline in California right now, 40% have been idled, or going to a landfill, which SB 1383 is requiring diversion of organics from landfills. So these suppliers are looking for alternative ways to manage that material, and that's why we're talking to them. Then on the back end, we're talking to the renewable energy users. And when you talk about hydrogen for use in transportation, fuel cell electric vehicles, we're talking to companies like Toyota Shusho, for instance, who's trying to develop a carbon or a hydrogen supply chain to the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach for decarbonizing the entire port operations, as well as the 15,000 heavy-duty trucks that go in and out of those ports every day. So we kind of work on both ends of that scale.
I mean, I think to me, the different stakeholders that are touched in our process are one of the things that's most exciting to me about this, about being part of a new and innovative business that can help support jobs and communities and really grow a new industry. For us, on the agricultural side, we pay for that feedstock, and so generally that's waste feedstock, so it's pure profit margin for agricultural partners. We also work with a lot of suppliers of machinery, so we expect that there's a lot of impact for the agricultural sector. And also, and on the forestry side as well, similarly, when we're working on waste feedstocks from forestry, so we work with forestry managers, and there's a lot of government entities involved in that. And then also for injecting our bio-oil, it's the exact same skill set as oil and gas services. So we are employing people in Kansas, for instance, who've worked in the oil and gas industry for many years, who are now instead putting carbon back underground for charm. So we expect that we have a wide range of job impacts. And because we have a mobile solution, we expect those impacts to be pretty widely distributed across the country. But we're headquartered in California, and there's a lot of work to be done here, so we expect a lot of those impacts to be local.
Well, we have a lot of participants in our project, starting from, our project is located in the city limits of McFarland, so we have a long-standing working relationship with the city. We have had and will continue to have outreach programs to identify parties within the ecosphere we live in, that we want to make sure we engage with them and take their considerations into account. We've done that, as I say, already, but we're just starting that. That will continue throughout the development of the project, even in the construction and operation. We've got to make sure this works right for everyone. We have lots of consultants working on our Class 6 permit, for example. We've got air permit applications pending. We've got secret process underway. Those are all professionals we hire in here in California. We anticipate that we will have an EPC contract for the project, which will be several $100 million of construction work. We're negotiating with a couple of California firms already on that arrangement. Offtake-wise, we're talking to people. I mean, our primary economic offtake is the RNG, which has very attractive qualities, because under our process, we actually produce a carbon negative RNG, which is pretty, that's a highly valued product. There's significant entities that are interested in contracting for our project, and we offer a supply scale of about, somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 MMBTU a day that we will generate in this plant. So there's a lot of interest in the quantity alone of the scale of this project is pretty astounding. On down the road, we have financing parties we're engaged with in terms of debt and equity structuring the project. hired legions of lawyers to deal with the permitting and tax aspects of this. We qualify for several of the new tax benefits under the IRA, so it's quite a collection of people that we've got involved in the process.
Yeah, and for each of you too, there's plenty of similarities, but also a quite diverse group, so this is great to hear from all three of you. I'm going to open it up to the audience and online to questions, but first I'd like to ask one last question of you all, and that's kind of, you've touched already a little bit on some of the challenges, with permitting and sourcing, and I'm curious what you all see as the key message that you'd like this audience to take home of opportunities and challenges and ways to, I think, make this novel industry kind of continue to thrive.
Well, I would say to you that the industry is right at the cusp of commercialization, and whatever support you can provide to companies like ours to get it over the threshold, we can use all the help we can, particularly finding capital for these types of projects. We're a very small entrepreneurial business, and attracting capital is often a difficult thing to do. So if we can find like-minded investors that can help us take it across the finish line, we would really enjoy that.
I'll echo something that I think has been said in a couple different contexts today, which is I think that it is very hard to really think about the scale and speed with which we need to scale carbon removal. And the pace at which we need to do so requires capital investment, it requires buyers, it requires a lot of policy changes and support in order to enable us to, we have to scale at something like 10 times the rate of any other industry that's had to scale, especially with this level of infrastructure. And so I think that there are just a number of different levers that need to be, I think the question is, the answer is everything in order to help support this industry and to enable us all to scale to meet the giant challenge that we have in terms of, how much carbon we need to remove in the next decade or 2 decades or 3 decades.
My focus is typically on getting things built, and to the point here, I think the combination of the federal government's and state government support for carbon solutions, broadly defined, is a very important baseline here. But in my own experience, I can tell you there's literally billions and billions of dollars of investment capital sitting on the sidelines waiting for deals to be done. And the key there is, do they make sense? Can they be done on time? And what do they cost? The biggest determinant in squaring that circle is certainty of permitting process and fixed rules that you can live with. My rule is tell me what the rules are and I figure out a way to build it. But if I don't know what the rules are, it's kind of hard to deal with. So the objective, my plea to this group would be, if we can solve these sequestration issues and get the process down, the quicker you get it done, the quicker we can get some CO2 in the ground.
Yeah, makes sense to me. I have some other questions, but first I'd like to open it up to the group here or online. Looks like there's a question in the back.
Hi, Katie Larson. I have a question for Nora. When we talk about permitting your projects, are those still within the Class 6 permitting process, or as bio-oil, is that a different permitting process?
Very good question. So we do not do Class 6 permitting because for us, a Class 6 well doesn't make sense because of the way that it's structured. We're actually really targeting Class 1 and Class 5, and for the most part, also looking at end-of-life assets, so either oil and gas wells or orphaned wells, areas where there's leakage of methane, where we can help by capping the well in the process of injecting bio-oil. And also even looking at mines and basically there's a lot of different structures that geologically could work for us that already exist, and that also there's a lot of programs currently interested in things that can help fill those wells and help solve some of those problems.
Thanks for that question.
Yes. Can you hear me? One of the questions was there were some old shuttered biomass plants around this region. Can they be retrofitted for your technology? you hear me?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, and the question is if all biomass plants can be retrofitted with your technology.
Can you retrofit oil plants with your new technology?
So oil production, I assume we're talking about here. And for our technology, we can start producing biogas today that could be used as a natural gas replacement for steam flooding. So we could get into the oil production business and lower the carbon intensity of the crude that's produced today with the vision to use that same technology to begin producing hydrogen either today or in the future as we shift from one energy source to another. So yes, our technology could be applied to help the oil business shift from fossil resources to renewable resources.
And you were saying that you can actually retrofit to produce hydrogen today, rather than also
The same technology that could be used to produce a gas to replace natural gas for steam flooding could also then be used to also make hydrogen. You can make one or the other or both.
Thanks.
So while we don't have facilities in the same way or plants, what I would say is the two areas where there's a lot of intersection, I think, is that we can use the assets that are here that are end of life, but also we can use the same skill sets in the workers that are here to inject that bio-oil, to transport the bio-oil. So we expect that there will be a lot of transition job opportunities in the work that we're going to do.
I think a very attractive feature of many of the technologies that are in play today is that conceptually what you're doing is taking long chain molecules that are contained in biomass and egg waste products, and rather than burning them, which has been the typical use to just liberate the energy content, what you're doing is actually taking the molecules apart and reassembling them in a way that produces economically viable end products, RNG in our case, or biochar, et cetera. The beauty of the process is once you've figured out how to manipulate the molecules, you can dictate what end product you want to do. So although our project is designed to produce renewable natural gas, we in fact produce hydrogen as a mid-step process, and if we wanted to, we could divert the hydrogen into a separate stream, make ammonia or a bunch of other products out of it. So the attractiveness of many of these technologies is their flexibility to change and make different end products depending on the changes in the economics as the plant goes through its life cycle.
Great to hear. Yeah.
How much of the business model is impacted by the 45Q provisions?
How much of the business, I'm going to repeat your question to make sure. How much of the business model is affected by 45Q provisions?
So I'll say for our business model, not at all, because we're not involved in carbon sequestration at this time. It could be possible that our burners could be converted to oxy burners to make a pure CO2 output that could be sequestered. But at this point, 45Q is not part of our overall business model.
Currently, what we do is not eligible for 45Q, which is the case for a lot of different technologies that are not specifically direct air capture or CCS. So it's something that we're actively working on, is ensuring that federal tax credits are more technology neutral and support the full range of options. What I'll say though is that when it comes to steel production, we would sequester a carbon stream, that would be eligible as sequestration, but for the actual carbon removal process, we currently are not eligible.
The 45Q structure was put into the IRA in order to incentivize sequestration in carbon wells. That provision is tied into a bunch of the other provisions that are technology. Some of them are technology specific, some of them aren't in the IRA. So for example, if you have a hydrogen production facility, you may not be able to qualify for the 45Q credits. There are all sorts of double dipping rules in the statute. Frankly, it's pretty complicated, and IRS is supposed to be giving guidance on that sometime later this summer, but we haven't seen it yet, and a lot of people are holding up because how they define what you can and cannot do will have a big impact on the economics of these projects, because the credit structure is really key in many of these applications. The Q wells, for example, you get $85 a ton for sequestration. So if you can't qualify for that, you're probably not going to do it well. So.
Great, That's a great question, and kind of brings me to, so one of the, I want to ask you all about what are the limitations and like where do you see the next step for scaling your technology up, or bikers in general? And one of them obviously is, qualifying for those credits, but what else do you see as, and where do you see the potential for scaling?
Well, for our technology, we are standard design, factory assembled, skid mounted. So our business model is diversified renewable energy production from locally generated waste in a local area. Now, we can scale our technology up many times, perhaps not to the scale of what Randy is doing, and I commend Randy for the scale of the project they're doing. We just don't quite have the stomach for that. We're trying to hit some singles and doubles and get some projects in the ground before we look at scaling up too dramatically. But we also believe that there's a viable business model for locally generated energy from locally generated waste.
For us, I'd say, we are really in the weeds right now of doing all of the work to figure out exactly how to dial in the exact right configuration of pyrolyzer, the exact right, like we've learned a lot in the injection process of bio-oil, including, some bio-oil that when mixed with water, hardened in a tanker, which meant that we had to replace some equipment. We are like really in the nitty gritty of those kind of like on the ground learnings right now, but part of how we are accelerating our business is by having many parallel paths. So we are building our own pyrolyzers. We are also using pyrolyzers that are built by others. We are also using bio-oil that's a waste product for other industrial processes, so that we're basically injecting and doing 24/7 operations and doing the R&D at once so that we can scale extremely quickly. So to me, the answer in terms of what is needed for scaling is sort of in line with what I was talking about before, which is that I think that what is really needed is for there to be incentives at both the state and the federal level in policy, for there to be markets that develop and people who are willing to pay for carbon removal, because this is, it is an incredibly important, there need to be signals so that there's investment, so that there's financing, so that all of these technologies can kind of get through that valley of death to be able to scale quickly and efficiently.
One of the beauties of the technology we're looking at and using in our facility at San Joaquin is that a characteristic of biomass feedstocks, it has several problems, but one of them is moisture content. Different things have different layers of moisture. Our almond trees here, we're expecting to use as the feedstock for our plant about 15% water, whereas wood chip plants in Maine that run on spruce trees have about 45% water in the feed. It's very difficult to bridge that gap. The other thing that you have to deal with is that the characteristics of the feedstock can vary over time. So we get almond trees in, we take in some almond shells, we put in walnut shells. We can make it work, but the chemical composition changes and that changes the output. The beauty of the technology we're employing is that it's flexible and we can engineer it to accommodate differences in both constituent feedstock and moisture content, things like that, on the fly. So it provides a basis for handling what we call the front end of the process, which is the gas fire itself or the thermal conversion process, in a way that we can engineer the results so that we're tolerant of the feedstocks and it doesn't become a fatal flaw aspect of the project design.
Right. Well, I want to wrap this up and I thank all three of you for sharing your expertise with the group. I'm sure I learned a lot and I'm sure they did too. If you all have any questions, feel free to come talk to them during the break. They are a wealth of knowledge in a very new industry, and so thank you so much for joining us and for that engaging discussion.
Thank you so much.